The atmosphere was silent, almost surgical. The marble floor reflected the white light streaming in through the wide windows. The walls, lined with fine wood, displayed discreet, abstract paintings, clearly chosen to say, "Important people belong here." Everyone inside moved with urgency and elegance. Tailored suits, expensive watches, the sound of leather soles tapping the floor blended with the click of keyboards and the low hum of financial consultations. It was a temple of wealth, and everyone knew their place. When Evelyn walked in, the noise didn't change, but something invisible shifted in the air. She moved with the calm of someone who had nothing to hide. A dark, crisply pressed overcoat, a red scarf around her neck, and flat shoes. Her hair was pulled back into a meticulous bun. She wasn't in a hurry. She looked like she knew exactly where she was. She reached the counter, where a young receptionist was absent-mindedly typing. "Good morning," she said in a clear, polite voice. "I have an appointment with a consultant, Evelyn Carter, 10:15. The receptionist glanced up, hesitated. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. She looked toward the back of the lobby where someone was watching. Then she stood and took a small step forward. "Ma'am, this location is for VIP clients only. Perhaps you're looking for another branch." Evelyn stood her ground. She didn't smile. She wasn't offended. She simply replied, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The appointment was confirmed over the phone." The receptionist pressed her lips together, trying to maintain composure. She gave Evelyn a quick but telling look, from head to toe. Someone else approached, a tall man in a dark suit, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't introduce himself, just stepped in like someone trying to quietly solve a problem. "Ma'am, we're not seeing any appointment under that name in our system. Would you kindly leave? This branch handles executive accounts. We can direct you to, or another nearby location." No voices were raised, no insults thrown. But something worse hung in the air. The certainty in their eyes. The unshakable belief that she didn't belong. "I'm not leaving," Evelyn said, still calm. "I have an appointment. My name is in the system. Look more carefully." The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he made a subtle gesture to one of the lobby security guards, who began to approach. It was a quiet movement, but loud in meaning. "Make her go away." Evelyn felt the eyes turning toward her, disguised, curious, judging. In that moment, her entire body felt like a statistical error, an outlier. She didn't shout, she didn't cry, but humiliation doesn't need sound. The guard, face unreadable, extended an arm in a restrained motion. "Ma'am, please." She hesitated. Her chest tightened, not because of the man in front of her, but because of the invisible weight pressing down on her. The same weight she'd felt entering stores, waiting in lines, trying to be heard. But that day, she wasn't there by chance. Without another word, she turned, lifted her chin, and walked calmly toward the glass doors. Outside, the wind was cold, but the fire in her chest was steady, controlled. Evelyn Carter stopped on the sidewalk, pulled her phone from her bag, dialed 2 numbers. Her voice was firm, unshaken. "You can come now. It's happening again." She hung up and waited. 16 minutes later, the glass doors opened once more. Evelyn Carter walked back in, but this time she wasn't alone. 2 men in dark suits walked beside her, leather briefcases in hand and purpose in their stride. The lobby froze, and someone started to sweat. Before she became just the black woman escorted out of a bank, Evelyn Carter had been many other things. Born in Savannah, Georgia in 1957, Evelyn grew up in a modest wooden house at the end of an unpaved street, where kids played barefoot in the mud and mothers hung clothes out to dry with wooden clothespins. It was a time when skin color wasn't just a difference, it was a sentence. Her father, James Carter, was a gardener. He worked from sunrise to sunset tending the yards of white families, often without ever being called by his name. Her mother, Loretta, was a seamstress who told her daughter every night before bed, "You're made of something they don't know how to measure." Evelyn was the oldest of 4 siblings. Early on, she learned to listen more than speak. She observed everything: the looks, the tones of voice, the dangerous silences. Life taught her day after day that to survive as a black woman, strength wasn't enough. You had to be strategic. At 12, she saw her mother humiliated in a store for trying to buy a blouse on installment. The white clerk tore up the application in front of them and said, "This isn't a place for people like you." That day, Evelyn promised herself that no one would ever again tell her where she did or didn't belong. Quiet, driven, and relentless, she became the first in her family to graduate high school and the first to leave Savannah. She earned a partial scholarship to study law at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She worked nights at a nearby diner and spent weekends caring for the elderly to pay rent and buy the books her scholarship didn't cover. During those 4 years, she faced quiet insults, skeptical professors, isolation, but she never shouted. She fought back with results, with perfect grades, with sharp arguments in academics, debates. She earned respect, admiration. She became irreplaceable. After graduating with honors, Evelyn made a decision that surprised many of her peers. She turned down offers from big corporate law firms. Instead, she returned to the South and devoted her life to racial justice and affordable housing causes. For nearly 3 decades, she represented families facing unfair evictions, battled school segregation, filed class action lawsuits against police abuse, and above all, empowered vulnerable black women. But her journey was also marked by loss. In 2005, she lost her husband Marcus to an aggressive cancer. He was a calm history teacher who stood beside her through marches, court hearings, and community meetings. His love was quiet and steady, like roots you can't see, but that hold up the whole tree. She became a widow at 48, raised their daughter alone, never remarried. She retired at 62, not from exhaustion, but to care for her newborn granddaughter. Since then, she had lived a peaceful life of quiet breakfasts, legal reading for pleasure, and frequent visits to the neighborhood library. The money she had saved over the years, built through cautious investments and a life of discipline, was placed under private management at a prestigious bank, a bank where the managers didn't know her personally, a bank where she kept discreet accounts, a bank she visited that morning to inquire about a new investment fund to secure her granddaughter's future as she prepared to start school. That was what brought her to that pristine, gleaming lobby in Manhattan. Not vanity, not a need to show off, just the responsibility to protect what she had built, with sweat and silence. What no one there knew, not the receptionist, not the man who dismissed her with poisoned courtesy, was that Evelyn Carter had been an attorney for a national civil rights organization for over 30 years, and that 2 of the most respected public defenders in the state with whom she'd shared countless federal court hearings were just 3 blocks away. When she made that phone call that morning, she wasn't asking for help out of fear. She simply said, "It's happening again." And those 2 men knew exactly what that meant. Now Evelyn was back in the bank. Beside her, 2 attorneys walked with steady posture. And in their hands, they carried more than briefcases. They carried truths powerful enough to shatter any polished facade. At reception, the same faces that had once brushed her off began to stir. Tense smiles, nervous steps, and a growing silence. The meeting room door swung open, and the game began to shift. The bank lobby felt frozen for a moment. Evelyn's footsteps echoed sharply on the marble floor, firmer than before. An uncomfortable silence settled over the glances that had earlier looked at her with suspicion. But this time, there was something different in her, and everyone could feel it. There was purpose, something in her eyes, something unsettling. At her side, 2 men walked in silence, both in dark suits, leather briefcases in hand, their backs straight, expressions calm, but a subtle tension in their shoulders, like men who had been here before, too many times, always for the wrong reason, or rather, for the same reason, racism. A staff member quickly stood up, rushed to the back, and called for a supervisor. Not the same man who had ordered Evelyn's removal earlier, but he would be there soon enough. After all, the mood had shifted. And when important people walk in with lawyers, banks pay attention. They were led to a private glass meeting room with partially closed blinds. Inside, a dark wooden table with 6 cushioned chairs, a pitcher of cold water, and a tablet resting atop a leather folder embossed with the bank's logo. Everything carefully arranged to seem welcoming. Evelyn sat quietly, glanced at her wristwatch. It was only 10:42 a.m. Barely 30 minutes had passed since she'd been escorted out. But it felt like a different day, a different world. A few minutes later, the branch manager walked in. The same face that had denied her entry now wore a strained, formal smile. No mention of what had happened minutes earlier. No word about the silent escort to the door. No attempt at a real apology. "Ms. Carter, I just received an update about your appointment. Seems there was a system error. You do in fact have a meeting scheduled with our senior consultant. I'd be happy to assist you personally if you prefer." The lie rolled off easily, too easily, and Evelyn caught it immediately. She held his gaze for 2 solid seconds, then spoke, calmly. "Interesting, because when I tried to explain that half an hour ago, I was treated like an intruder, escorted out of the building without a single attempt to verify anything. By a security guard." The manager shifted slightly but composed himself, tried to regain control. "Ms. Carter, I understand there was a misunderstanding. We follow very specific protocols regarding security and client profiles." One of the attorneys interrupted politely but firmly. "Forgive me, but we need to clarify something before we continue. This is a clear case of racial profiling. Ms. Carter has held an executive account with this bank for over 8 years. Her portfolio alone places her among the top 2% of this branch's clientele, and yet she was questioned, dismissed, and escorted out as if she were a threat." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the lawyer continued. "This was not a misunderstanding, it's a pattern. That's why we're here, to formally document this incident, and to demand it be investigated thoroughly, because people like Ms. Carter are tired of being humiliated for appearing out of place in spaces where they belong, often more than the ones running them." Tension filled the room. Through the glass, employees peeked discreetly, trying to understand what was happening. A meeting off script? Clearly. Evelyn stayed silent for a moment. Then she leaned forward and said, "You know what bothered me the most today?" The manager looked up, hesitant. It wasn't being doubted. I've lived with that all my life. Not even being escorted out. That's happened before. What bothered me most was the look of certainty on your faces. The confidence with which you decided I didn't belong here. That reveals something deeper. This isn't about error. It's about conviction. The conviction that a woman like me, with my color, my age, and my calm demeanor, could only be here by mistake." The manager swallowed hard. He didn't respond, just glanced down at the tablet in front of him, as if seeking refuge in some other task. "This is personal," Evelyn said. "But it's not just about me. It's about everyone who carries that kind of gaze on them every single day, in every kind of space. This bank, and many others, needs to review more than just its systems. It needs to review its culture. Because your prejudice isn't in the protocols, it's in your eyes." A heavy silence settled over the room. No one moved for a moment. Then Evelyn stood, calmly, picked up her purse. One of the attorneys handed a document to the manager. "This is a formal notice," he said. "Ms. Carter is fully aware of her rights, and now so is this bank." Before leaving, Evelyn looked at the manager one last time. "If I don't look like a VIP client to you, Maybe it's time you rethink what success looks like. But what Evelyn didn't yet know, what she was about to find out, was that this incident wouldn't end here. That same afternoon, footage from the security camera would leak, and the entire country would come to know her name, and the bank's name too. Early that afternoon, the bank branch continued operating under its usual rhythm of quiet luxury and calculated control. But something was no longer the same. Inside the meeting room, the presence of Evelyn and her two attorneys had left behind more than paperwork. It left behind unease, a lingering discomfort that drifted through the hallways, across the service desks, up the private elevators. The news spread quickly, though discreetly. It was like a muffled fire smoldering from within. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside the foundation trembled. A few hours later, something unexpected happened. One of the tellers, a quiet young woman who rarely lifted her eyes, stepped into the break room and discreetly pulled her phone from her purse. After several long seconds of hesitation, she opened her messaging app and typed something simple to a contact saved only as Aunt Rena. "I can't pretend this is normal anymore." Then she attached the surveillance footage from the reception area, captured that morning. The clip clearly showed Evelyn being asked to leave the bank, despite showing no inappropriate behavior. It captured the suspicious glances, the impatient gestures, and above all, the cold confidence with which the action was carried out. There was no sound, but the silence said everything. The video began to circulate in private groups, among activists, legal professionals, and journalists long familiar with cases of structural racism in financial institutions. And then, in less than an hour, it broke through those barriers. It hit Twitter, Instagram, then the news outlets. Evelyn Carter became a trending hashtag. She didn't look like a VIP client. The caption accompanying the video sparked collective outrage. It wasn't. Long before verified accounts, politicians, artists, lawyers, and influencers were reposting the clip. Evelyn's face, dignified, calm, wronged, now filled thousands of phone screens. She was no longer alone. Now she represented millions. In her Harlem apartment, Evelyn sat in her reading chair, still wearing the same overcoat from that morning. A cup of now cold tea sat forgotten on the side table. Her phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Calls, messages, interview requests, press inquiries. Still, she remained silent. Across the city, her lawyers, longtime allies in the fight, were organizing documents, reviewing her account's contract, pulling transaction histories, and most importantly, compiling all similar complaints made against the bank over the past 5 years. This would not be treated as an isolated incident. It was the tip of an iceberg, and they knew it. The next morning, at the start of the day, a press conference was held outside the bank. Cameras, microphones, reporters. The marble lobby was now being seen from the outside through dozens of lenses. Inside, the staff couldn't hide their unease. The polite smiles were gone, and control was slipping through the cracks in the bank's image. Evelyn arrived, accompanied by the same two attorneys. She wore a simple gray suit, a white shirt, and the red scarf around her neck. Her eyes held a calm that came not from pride, but from conviction. She walked to the makeshift podium, facing the cameras. The press leaned in. She didn't read a speech. She didn't cite statistics. She didn't try to impress. She spoke the way she had always lived, with truth. What happened to me yesterday happens to thousands of people every day, and almost always, without witnesses, without video, without a voice, without justice. The only difference is that this time it was seen, recorded, shared. That doesn't make it worse than the others. It just makes it visible. She took a breath. The wind gently lifted the scarf at her neck. They told me I didn't look like a VIP client, which really means you don't look like someone who deserves respect. What I wonder is, how many others have been turned away, humiliated, or ignored simply because they didn't look like the right kind of person to be here? The cameras captured every word. Some reporters lowered their eyes. Others watched, visibly moved. The problem isn't just with this bank. It's with how we've been taught to view success. As something white, young, male, tall, silent, and always, always far from who we are. She looked around. Today, I don't just speak for myself. I speak for everyone who's ever been treated like they were in the wrong place, when they were exactly what that place needed. One of the attorneys handed a dossier to the press. It contained evidence of recurring discriminatory practices, testimonies from former employees, and data linking the bank to systemic exclusion. The truth, buried under letterhead and non-disclosure agreements, was coming to light. The press conference ended with applause, but not for show. It was for relief, for recognition, for justice in motion. In the hours that followed, the bank's leadership tried to issue a statement, but it was too late. Evelyn Carter's name was no longer just the name of a woman. It was the name of a movement. And in front of the cameras, something even bigger was about to unfold. The branch manager who had ordered her removal would now be pulled into the spotlight. And for the first time, he would have to explain what had until then always happened in silence. On the 5th day after the incident, the morning broke with a strange tension in the air. The front pages of major newspapers bore Evelyn Carter's face, alongside headlines she herself would have once found unlikely. Attorney humiliated by structural racism ignites national reckoning on elitism in U.S. banking. She didn't look like a VIP client becomes a rallying cry for justice and truth in finance. The entrance of Bank and Trust Capital was now watched by journalists, camera crews, and demonstrators. Small signs had begun to appear. I don't look VIP either. Respect has no appearance. The system is the problem. Evelyn Carter, however, remained composed. She wasn't chasing headlines. She didn't want fame. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was dignity. For herself, for her people, for those yet to come. The morning of the public hearing called by the National Council on Financial Ethics saw every seat filled. Representatives from the bank sat in neat rows, folders in hand, rehearsed statements at the ready. But nothing had prepared them for what was coming. Under the glare of spotlights, the room held its breath. The manager who had ordered Evelyn's removal just days earlier now sat before a panel of judges, microphone in front of him, eyes downcast. When asked about the incident, his voice trembled. There was an error, a misunderstanding in the identification protocol. There was no intent to discriminate. But he was cut off by a member of the commission. Can you tell us exactly what led you, in a matter of seconds, to decide that this woman could not possibly be a VIP client? Silence. The man hesitated, swallowed hard. No technical explanation would do. No corporate phrasing could cover up what everyone already knew. It wasn't the protocol. It was prejudice. In the audience, Evelyn watched him with the same calm as always. Her gaze held no vengeance, only clarity. When she was invited to speak, she stood slowly, took the microphone, and looked out at the room as if addressing an entire country. What happened to me is the result of a system that equates worth with appearance. That decides who deserves respect based on surface-level standards. I was judged by my skin color, my age, my quiet demeanor, and, perhaps most cruelly, for not seeming like a threat, and still being treated like one. She paused, looked directly at the manager. I don't need an apology from you, because you didn't act alone. You acted with the approval of a culture, with the silence of your colleagues, with the complicity of an entire system that teaches every day that the educated black person, the successful black person, the calm black person, is still a threat. The room fell silent for several long seconds. But today, I'm here to say, the time for silence is over. This case isn't just about me. It's about a country that needs to look at itself honestly and, Rebuild with justice. The applause started softly, then grew into a standing ovation. Evelyn didn't smile. She simply sat down again, with dignity. In the days that followed, the bank was formally fined for discriminatory conduct. The branch manager was removed. Racial bias re-education programs were rolled out urgently. But beyond the administrative consequences, what truly changed was the way a nation began to question what it means to belong. Months later, Evelyn returned to her quiet routine. Her granddaughter now walked the school halls with a new sparkle in her eyes. She knew her grandmother wasn't just some old lady. She was a name, a story, a flame. Evelyn received invitations to events, panels, and hearings, but she only accepted when she felt the invitation came with purpose, not as a gesture of optics. One evening, after returning from a seminar on economic justice, she sat in her favorite armchair. Her eyes fell on an old photo resting on the shelf. She and her husband, smiling, arms wrapped around each other beneath an oak tree in the backyard where it had all begun. She closed her eyes and thought, "They still try to push us out of the places we belong, but now they know. We come back, and we come back with a voice."